Lovely. Right. Well, welcome to the RTPI North East President's virtual visit. And I'm going to say a big welcome to Sue Manns, who's our president this year. Thanks to Sue for joining us in the North East today on the first of two visits. And also thanks to Geoff and Abbey from Newcastle University for joining us to talk about their project, nationally significant project. We'll hear about that later as an example of something great happening in the North East. So, for those who don't know me, I'm sure you do, but I'll just quickly say I'm Tim Crawshaw. I'm the North East Regional Chair of the RTPI this year. I'm also, for those who don't know, the Chair of the Tees Valley Nature Partnership, so I've got a lot of interest in green infrastructure and habitats and ecology and the power of nature really to be part of the solution alongside planning, obviously. And I'm also the incoming Chair of the Historic Towns and Villages Forum, so I do get around a little bit. But anyway, enough of me. Sue, please could you say a few words about you and how this year's been? It's extraordinary and unprecedented are quite understatement words. Yeah, maybe just a few words about you if you can, just before we start.
Thank you so much, Tim, and thank you everybody for inviting me to be here today. Being a president of the RTPI is an absolute honour and a privilege, and it is so enjoyable. It brings, apart from having myself worked in public sector, private sector, worked at regional, national level, at local level, in the voluntary sector, and also academia, it's this opportunity just to bring everything together and to share in what is absolutely the best of the best in terms of planning. In terms of the year, well, it's certainly not the year that anybody expected at all in any way, and I could never have written anything to work out as it has, but there are some incredible positives, and one has been the warmth of the welcomes that I've had in the regions in the same way you've just done, Tim, there. But the fact that I can actually be in two places at almost the same time is a real win-win. So thank you so much, and I'm really, really looking forward to this session. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Sue. Thank you. Okay, so welcome to the North East. Iconic in so many ways. Iconic places. This is a skyline you wouldn't readily forget. And I sort of characterise this. I'm from the North East. This is we talk about bounce backs these days. The fortunes of the quayside in Newcastle have been one of the sort of big bounce backs when you think about the economic restructuring that took place at the end of the 70s and the early 80s. The North East is resilient in both in terms of people and place, and there's many success stories. But the thing that I think I always have to bear in mind, I think, you look at these things and you go, oh, isn't that great? This is a multi-layered history that's taken quite a lot of vision and a long time to get to where we are. And you go, and it's a great place to visit. And I suppose before any of the city stuff happened, the natural and heritage environment is a key part of the North East's cultural heritage. We're at the beginnings of modern culture in so many different ways, and then obviously through the Industrial Revolution, innovation, and hopefully in the future a real leader in terms of the green recovery. We've got so many natural assets in the North East, which were the reasons why much of industry started happening here. But also now when we try to revision visions of place and the environment and what keeps us well, the North East has so many natural assets that are being restored over time, and I think there's a great appreciation of now as we think about the green recovery and still the ongoing task of repairing damaged landscapes from years of industrial exploitation, really. But the North East has an image problem, and this isn't just a superficial view that you might have. This is actually the reality for many people. It's got a slightly aged photograph. The reason why I put that up is though because actually in many ways not much of this other than the car registrations will have substantially changed. I think there's a massive challenge that we have with some of the existing places that we have, and I know in the business of planning at the moment we tend to think a lot more about facilitating new things to happen. There's a big job of work to do to make sure that our places aren't left behind. And I think the 10-year life expectancy difference in the North East is really one of those things. It's not a particularly easy thing to solve. That difference is stark, persistent, and hard to tackle. So, I mean, just a bit of a background. I'm going to do the doom and gloom. This is like the local news list, but unemployment in the North East is higher than anywhere else in the UK. And this is a real, it's a real problem, and some of this has been ongoing and multi-generational. and life's been tough for many people and maybe about to get tougher. And I think that, you know, employment is key. It's the key indicator of where, you know, your health outcomes and everything else. So an access to quality employment is a massive priority. And I think planning should be, and is, and, you know, in many ways, we'll see some examples later where planning is at the centre of that. But, you know, that is a platform for planning to make such a big difference, facilitating economic growth, not in the eyes of, you sometimes get the rhetoric that we're getting in the way. There's many people I know who are actually pedaling like mad to make things happen and make places better. North East lags behind on productivity and spending and on innovation, but no longer, and this is the advantage I think we have with where we are now, is that this isn't no longer a geographically based thing. You may have seen people in your own community in the North East you hadn't seen for years, who actually do live in your town or whatever, but actually are making their money elsewhere, but are now making their money at home. And it is possible to actually work now without being tied to be anywhere near the South East or London in terms of the sort of work that you could be doing. And I think that ripples out then into the wider community and our communities in the North East itself. So, you know, this is a sort of slightly worrying thing, but it's also a massive opportunity when you think about where we could be in the North East. Again, education performance, again, a real challenge for us. You know, it's North East is at the bottom of the class in terms of educational attainment. And there's loads of reasons. I'm not an educational expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think somewhere in this, there's a link to aspiration and crucially, you know, destinations post-education. And that whole cycle of places being somewhere that you grow up and want to stay as well and everything else. And us to be able to rebuild actually our sense of ourselves and communities and everything else is central to that. And again, last doom and gloom, I've got to say, but I think this gives you a bit of a snapshot. Here's an indicator. So fuel poverty, you may have seen some of the existing housing, which to be fair, 95% of that will still be here in 30 years time. You know, the highest levels of fuel poverty in England, and it's a systemic health issue, and it's not currently tackled by new builds, you know, no matter what standards we set. And in fact, many ways, you know, as housing becomes available, it leaves less desirable housing to be in the hands of private landlords who probably don't know anything about being a landlord, but it was seen as being a pretty solid sort of investment. And actually the quality of the existing housing is a big issue. And I think somehow we need to square the circle in terms of a retrofitting drive. And I know that potentially money's on the horizon, but I think money without a plan is always less effective than money with a plan. And it seems to me we should be thinking about how do we integrate green infrastructure, public space, how people are going to get around in the future, sustainable transport, local work opportunities, whether that's shared space or local employment and everything else, in places that actually only have 50% car ownership on average anyway in some of our deprived neighbourhoods. So broadly speaking, you know, we have an opportunity to try to re-knit together these different places that have often been left behind. And a little example potentially, and the things that I find shocking when I've looked into this in terms of, you know, things like tackling fuel poverty, is that if you haven't got anywhere warm to do your homework, you can't do your homework. You know, if you haven't even got a level surface, and I think we have to really think about the quality of the stuff, both that we are building, quite rightly through space standards, but also have a very good long hard think about the housing quality of the existing stuff and find mechanisms to invest in that. And I know that some you know, things like carbon offsetting funds and the like are things that really should be there. And you do see that, and I see that when I work around the country, you know, these beginnings of being able to get you know, benefits for CO2 reductions that have co-benefits all the way around, if you want to look at it that way, for people's housing conditions and everything else. So let's talk about the region in terms of our membership, because, you know, we're an active bunch here. We have a steady number of chartered members. You know, we're not losing, we're not gaining, but we've managed to maintain a strong chartered membership. We do struggle a bit with you know, converting you know, memberships into chartered memberships. You know, I think a big challenge for us is a dwindling number of public sector planners as well, which is a big issue. And I think when I'll explain some of the projects I'll show about what's happening in the local area, without local authority leadership, I think that you know, everything's much harder. And I think us supporting our public sector colleagues is really, really important. My background for 15 years before the last 2 was in the public sector, and I know what a hard mile that actually is. So, you know, for me, we need to do that, and we are actually actively on with our, you know, our local government project, which is in development at the moment, to try and engage with councils. And you'll see later with Geoff's project as well, something in there about the role of planners as, you know, in society, and that role of local authorities is a really, really important part of that. We have incredibly active young planners who put on last year's conference, which went down very well, and some of the feedback, to be fair, wasn't just because it was an awesome conference, but what an awesome skyline too, which was great to hear about Newcastle and everything else. And alongside that, you know, we have very active groups within planning, like Women in Planning, are very active locally as well. So there's a very, I'd like to think there's you know, a diverse scene. It could be more diverse, but you know, we're a very active crew in the North East. And we celebrate excellence, so we were very, very glad to have you here last year, coming along to our ceremony. It seems like a long time ago. It's less than a year, but you were there, and you saw the diversity of the projects that we've celebrated and will be celebrating this year, and there's a good examples of those. So, you know, I think you might be aware of the diversity of some of the stuff and the quality of what happens in the North East, often in really, really difficult and challenging circumstances. I've worked in regen substantially when I was in the public sector, and I always used to say it was a bit like trying to start the car on a cold morning. You know, it's everything you do can be just that little bit harder sometimes in the North East. So here's a good example of something, a little initiative that's had huge ripples. This is the Life Kitchen, last year's winner. I don't potentially have to remind you of this one as what a quality scheme it was. It makes a regional splash, even though it's a very small project, but little projects like this require so much interdisciplinary working, and actually underpinned by a vision that you need to have to be that thing that makes the difference in the area. I remember visiting this, and the ripple effect that was starting to happen already with surrounding properties just shows the power of an investment, and sometimes not a massive one in terms of how people view their place. On a different scale, I think, we've got, you know, last year's multi-award winner nationally, which was the Spanish City at Whitley Bay. Amazing just to see the power of a building that's been, you know, actually put right, has now become the heart of the community again. You've got the ripple effect that I just love to see when you put the investment into a place, and you can see the public realm around it and everything else, but also that each property, as you could see, almost the further away you got from it, though, the more that ripple had gone. But that immediate sort of domino effect of investment once confidence is shown. And I think you see that all the time. And for me, the power of planning is to actually, you know, when I say turning over the ground, to give the opportunities for investment to happen and identify where that investment should go. Planning is and should be at the absolute heart of that economic regeneration piece. So, an example of that in this year's, you know, we haven't finalised the shortlisting yet, so there's, but in this sense, here's a project in Hartlepool. Hartlepool is, you know, an area that's really struggled. I'm not, you know, I'm not going to make any, you know, I'm not going to, you know, sweeten the pill on that one. You know, Hartlepool's had a lot of problems over the years, and here's an example of a fantastic investment in a business centre that's upskilling the population, that's creating the conditions for people to be able to access and develop high quality jobs, both for themselves and also to be able to access high quality employment. You know, historic area, listed building, innovation quarter. You know, you put all these together, and what is on one level seen as being constraints actually become the grist in the mill, the absolute opportunity. And I think planning brings those people together, brings all the disciplines together, and makes sure that the investment hits right and is targeted. Another example here, this is the sort of hard mile again. You know, just the proper under the bonnet planning work that goes on in local authorities to try and bring sites forward, to start to think about what the real heavy lifting looks like in terms of infrastructure, to be able to bring forward a site that's been sat there as long as I can remember, you know, ready to go. But ready to go for what? And there's one question. Ready to go where? There's another question. How do you get to that? But this is a sustainable location, brownfield site, absolutely awesome example of all this underpinnings, which often isn't, you know, massively glamorous, but without these first thoughts, without this sort of strategic overview, it's very difficult then to actually give direction or actually give vision and leadership. And here again is a really, really good example. So this is the Helix, Newcastle University, and a building that's going the extra mile in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of setting the tone for what a building like this should do in the context of a city, with academia at the heart of it. And I think that triple helix of academia, public sector, private sector, all these different forces coming together is the stuff that shows that we can innovate and do innovate in the North East, with the kind of, you know, life sciences or whatever else, the different sectors. It's really important that that rate is maintained, and actually we're not going to be geographically limited in the same way we were by not being in the Southeast, for example. You know, here we are, we can do this in the Northeast, and the knowledge economy, you know, can transcend borders. Just to give you a little example of ones, and this is where I think local authorities sometimes undersell some of the things they do, which are actually really difficult to do sometimes. Was never nominated for anything, but it's just I'm aware of it because of the work I do in, you know, helping other councils with energy efficiency and planning policy that's related to climate change and everything else. Here's Stockton-on-Tees local plan, 2019, defended at examination in public policies, which in many places people go, you can't do that. You know, a Merton Rule style policy getting through and being defended and being adopted and seen as sound and everything else now, and it's happening, whereas lots of councils have run away from that and not done that hard mile. And I think there was a lot of just really good solid planning that had gone into that document. And I think this is it, a local plan on one level. You know, many people never read them, but actually this is how you set the tone. And I think there's some really good stuff in that as well. And again, we're actively, as the North East, involved in research. If there was never been a greater need, actually, for the Great North Plan, and if with the government's talking about levelling up, you know, like I say, as planners, we've got the map and we've got the compass. You know, we need to be guiding where this happens and how it happens and everything else. And we're actively participating in research in terms of pilots around sustainable transport. And again, we've been lucky enough to participate in that, and we're very, very, very excited about that, because actually, again, you know, the things we need in the North East are often different to other parts of the country. Even though we're part of a bigger constellation that's the North, the North East again has very specific things, and we need to champion what we do really well, but also we're really clear about what we need help with as well in the North East. So I'll just give you a final slide here, maybe a surprising picture of a corner of the North East, which often, without being Newcastle centric, but share the Tees Valley Nature Partnership as well, I'm all too aware of that actually our natural assets are really, really important. There's some surprising statistics around that. People often look at you know, agricultural land and say that must be doing a good thing for carbon emissions. Actually, in the Tees Valley, for example, a lot of people don't realise that much of that's coming from agriculture and horticulture. So this is the value, though, of having been a pilot, and we're part of a national pilot there around the natural capital accounting, which will ultimately become part of a natural capital investment plan. But the thing that I keep banging the drum about is without some sort of regional spatial framework for that, cross-border working becomes really, really difficult. I do think we need to square the circle on what regional planning looks like, whether that's joint strategic plans or something else post-white paper. We need to be able to work cross-border to actually tackle climate change, you know, have a natural recovery and actually reconnect people back to nature, because nature feeds us. And then that becomes the starting point for our next round of interventions as we plan for the future. So that's really a snapshot of the North East, sort of back in the room, as they say. There we are. So I hope you enjoyed that.
I did. It was really fascinating, and I think things that you said, like the bounce back, will resonate and with a lot of people. I think some of the challenges that you described, like the fuel poverty one, that's something I really recognise, because you've probably spotted on the table, the West Midlands, my region, is only 0.1% behind the North East. So these, you know, I really get what's there. But what really came through was the quality of the work that's coming forward, the schemes that are coming forward, and the ones from like Life's Kitchen and the Spanish City that we saw when I came up last time. And there are some really good things coming forward, and it's about how we actually promote and shout out about planning. And to some extent, I mean, we've had to suffer the sort of planner bashing rhetoric before the white paper, but since the white paper, I don't know about you, but the press, I feel the press have actually swung towards us, and the press are starting to defend good planning. So to me, it's a really great time for us to get out there and talk about what is good planning and a lot of the things that you've actually touched on. I love the image of Ambitions for the North, because that was one of my greatest experiences as Vice President, launching that with Michael Heseltine up in Leeds. And listening to him, he is so inspiring, and he's talking all the same things that he talked about sort of in the 1980s that we're still talking about today. But you can also see how we've moved forward. You can see how things have changed, and we don't want to lose sight of just how far we've come, and we want to keep banging the drum on that. So absolutely fascinating, really, really good. Thank you so much.
No worries. No worries. Thank you, Sue. Okay, that's great. So the next part of our event, and this is the virtual event like played out, because ordinarily we'd all get in a car and we'd drive around and we go and see Geoff and the team, wouldn't we, at Newcastle, and have a cup of tea and maybe a bit of cake and that sort of thing, and then we talk about it. And actually the real advantage of this is we can do that and everybody else is watching. Oh, sorry, you need to realise we'll be recorded. I know, but it's great. So yeah,
that's a real positive. The fact that what we're talking about here now isn't just for those who are tuning in now, but by the virtue of sort of YouTube, it's out there for everyone. And for students who want to look back, or anyone looking back on things and learning, it's the most fantastic resource that we're creating through the virtual world.
Absolutely. Andy Warhol was right, but we're all famous for a bit longer, aren't we now? I think maybe, I think it's like, because there's a channel on my telly now, and it's actually called YouTube. You used to have like ITV, BBC One and BBC Two. Now, literally, if you can find it, you can watch it, can't you? So I'm hoping somebody out there is enjoying this in the future. So there we are. So I think moving towards our next presentation now is Geoff and Abbey to talk about working in the public interest project. That's right, isn't it? Yeah, WITPI. Yeah. You have to say it that way. Yeah,
that's the one.
Yeah.
Right.
So if you have a presentation, perhaps you could share that with us, Geoff. That'd be great.
Yeah. Let's see if the technology works to start with. Can you see the presentation?
I can see all your other slides. Checking away the you need to do the full screen thing. Yeah.
How's that? That better?
Awesome. Yeah.
Great. Okay. So this is a research project which has now finished. It finished in July. It's a collaboration between a team of us at Newcastle, myself, Abbey, who's here with us today, Zan Gunn, who can't be here today, 3 colleagues at Sheffield University, and Ben Clifford at UCL. It's called Working in the Public Interest, with a subtitle of Exploring the Role of the Private Sector in Planning. We've been interested for a while in what we think is the sort of under-researched nature of private sector involvement in town planning. I think in the public mind still, planning is probably a sort of public sector profession. And I think in some of our mind, I mean my mind perhaps, maybe not in other people's, but we tend to think of planning as a sort of, largely public sector activity. And yet, 40-something% of planners for a few years now have been working in the private sector. So we've been very interested in that. I'll say a bit more about methodology in a minute, but we haven't just been looking at private sector planners. We have been looking at public sector planners, all through the lens of this idea of the public interest. So those people who are watching who have a planning education are probably aware of this idea of the public interest. They probably use it as a sort of justification for some of the things they do, but it's always notoriously hard to define, what is this thing in the public interest? In 1947, we were a bit more confident about what we thought it was. Society was much more homogenous. There was a greater belief in experts to tell us what should be done. Nowadays, all those things are a little bit more complicated. So we've done a number of things, but the main thing I'm going to talk about today is some observational work we've been doing, what we call an ethnography. So some of the team, and Abbey has been spearheading a lot of this, have been sort of basically following planners around all day and trying to get some sense of what they actually do all day. A lot of research in planning is typically based on sort of interviewing methodologies, where you ask a planner what they think about something, and they tell you, and but often actually we all in our daily lives slightly lose sight of what it is we're actually doing. We might think we spend most of our time doing task X, but actually it might be that we're not doing so much of that, and actually we're doing a lot of something else. So we're hoping really that this will be a way of kind of showing some of the sort of habits and underlying routines that we almost take for granted, but which are actually quite important. So the project is inspired by these notions, as I said, of the privatization of a lot of planning work, the commercialization of planning work actually in the public sector too, the fact that a lot of work now is being done and paid for by the private sector and undertaken in the public sector, and vice versa. And what we're interested in is how those kind of processes shape the idea of what planners do in this notion of the public interest. And as I said, we've had 5 work packages. One was a sort of historical thing where we look back to the early years of planning in 1947. That's been quite interesting in showing how some of these debates kind of keep resurfacing over the years. We've also done a number of focus groups in every part of the United Kingdom, in Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland, as well as England. We've done some biographical interviews. We did about 25 interviews where we interviewed a planner about their career, and also why did they become a planner? What seeded the idea of becoming a planner in their sort of teenage mind, if you like, and seeing if we can draw some sort of things out of analysing their career in public sector, private sector. They've often moved between the two, and reflecting on that. And then there's the ethnography, which I talked about, where we've worked in 5 different organisations. And then our 5th work package is the sort of dissemination, such as we're doing today. So what I'm going to talk about today is primarily these 5 ethnographic cases. What can we learn about planning from observing what planners do in these different organisational settings? And what we try and do is we record and describe. We're not trying to explain what we're seeing. We're often trying to just relate it very simply. What is happening in this meeting? Who seems to have the power in this meeting? Who is talking more than others? Those kind of things. And also try and think about some of the influence of the settings in which these things are performed. For example, I attended a planning inquiry, and I hadn't done that for a while, and I was very struck actually by just how archaic and bizarre a planning inquiry actually is, and how it seems to be dominated by the norms of the legal profession and not the planning profession. And those things seem to be interesting and might explain something about the way that that things actually decisions are actually made within planning, which we might not see normally if we're not looking for them. And so the following presentation is really structured around material things. We're going to talk a little bit about the buildings in which planning work is performed. And we're also going to do semiotic linguistic observations. So that is, we're looking for what people say, but also some of the signs and some of the sort of weird things that exist in planning offices, in different planning offices, which might tell us something about the culture of that organisation, and then the way in which they do planning work, and the way in which perhaps they then conceive of the public interest. And then I'll put out some more or less controversial discussion points at the end, which we can maybe have a little bit of a chat about. Okay, so buildings. One of the interesting things is we don't really think very much about the settings in which planning is performed. It's very intimidating, actually. We went to planning committees, very intimidating for members of the public. You could see how intimidated some of these people were walking into some of these settings, which were not normal radar, you know, whether they be a grand neoclassical building or whether they be a sort of edge city office park. It's a very unnerving setting for people who don't move in and out of those all day. But what does it mean for the planners to be located in certain types of buildings? We had one case study which used to be in a very typical kind of, you know, municipal Victorian town hall, and now they were in a sort of edge city business park, such as you see on the screen. And actually that was an interesting thing. It made a difference if you were coming as a member of the public to a place that used to be on your high street, and now you had to take a bus to get to. It didn't even have a location. It just had a sort of postcode, and it was a weird sort of environment, really. It felt odd to us as researchers, and I think it probably felt quite odd to citizens. And I think the planners had got used to it, but I think there was something interesting about the way that those sort of things impact on ideas of sort of civics. You know, what is it you're doing and for whom, and the sort of ideas of corporate power. Similarly, some of the private sector organizations we looked at were in very sort of plush city centre offices, you know, canal side, riverside, you know, high-end property, very, very swanky, you know, nice decoration, nice artwork on the walls. And what, you know, do those things matter? And that's one of the things we might talk about in the beginning, because we sort of think that, you know, those things do matter, and they're sort of reflective of certain beliefs and certain economic realities, and they afford some things and they also inhibit others. And again, we'll talk a bit about that when we come to it. One of the things we also looked at was the planning workplace. And again, probably a lot of planners who might be listening to this take a lot of this for granted. But it's quite interesting looking at the fact that, you know, open plan is now universal in a way which it probably wasn't 2 or 3 decades ago. Hot desking was pretty much universal across our 5 case studies. Working from home was pretty universal, 1 day a week. Obviously now that's much more embedded as a way of going on. We found planners looking at multiple screens. You know, we found them often with 3 screens open, you know, and that was sometimes because due to commercial pressures, they were actually working for another local authority while also working for their own local authority as a sort of, you know, as something that their local authority had won a contract to perhaps help with the preparation of a local plan in another area. And we also found that, you know, IT systems were not talking to each other, so they needed to have, you know, one system which was running the kind of software required for the development management system, and another one which was running something else. We found that the paperless office was very much a reality everywhere. We found that was interesting at things like inquiries, where consultants came absolutely loaded, like van loads of paper, and local authorities weren't allowed to turn up with any, and how that kind of changed the power dynamics in the room. We looked at reception areas. We noted who drank coffee, who drank tea. The fact that, you know, some of the high-end, this is a bit of a stereotype, but some of the private sector organizations had very high-end espresso machines. Some of the local authorities had rather moldy, chipped selections of mugs. And again, did this matter when, you know, visitors came from the outside and so forth? We observed a lot of banter. 3 of our locations were in the north, and I think those were particularly full of banter, not exclusively. And we particularly found a lot of banter in the public sector. There was a lot of gallows humour, and I'll talk a bit about that later. And what did we find as we were looking at work life? Well, what we call work intensification is everywhere. People are working harder, they're working longer hours, but they're working much harder within those hours, however hard those hours were. That was what was reported to us, and that was what we were observing. You know, and we also found that, you know, developers would drop something on the local authority at 4:30 in the afternoon for a committee meeting at 10 o'clock the next day, and then that planner would be working till 8, 9 o'clock in the night trying to resolve or trying to head off, say, a judicial review. So that intensification was everywhere. It was in the private sector, it was in the public sector, and not always understood on either side, actually, the public sector not understanding the pressures of the private and vice versa. There was a lot of stress around, and that was damaging, but often people kind of took some refuge in that, and it conveyed a sort of power, status and fulfillment. You know, people were busy and they quite liked being busy sometimes. They quite liked the sort of status that gave them. There were issues of work-life balance, as you might find in any workplace organization these days. And there was this rhetoric and realities of always on, your phone being connected to your email, as I said, dropping something at 4:30 on the day before a committee meeting, which meant that you could do nothing but respond to that. And then the pressures of commercialization in the public sector we found very redolent. One of our local authority case studies was undergoing a huge commercialization drive, having to account for their time in 5-minute windows and very much looking to sort of bid for work elsewhere and do a whole set of mechanics around commercialization, which was creating an awful lot of pressure on the planners that were left. Relationships. We looked a lot, we sat in a lot of meetings actually. You know, one of the things we can probably all say is that planners do sit in a lot of meetings. And, you know, again, one of our case studies seemed to spend an awful lot of their life in meetings. Not necessarily a bad thing in many ways. There was a lot of learning going on in those meetings, but it was interesting that level did change a bit across case studies. But we found a lot of planner bashing actually from other planners, particularly private sector planners. I sat in on business development meetings where private sector organizations were meeting each other and kind of trading stories, you know. So this quote, if our local planning systems operated sensibly with universally competent officers, we'd have to find something else to do for a living, said a planning lawyer. And I was quite shocked actually with the amount of you know, really quite nasty rhetoric I was witnessing. You know, even though obviously they're aware that I'm in the room, they didn't really hold back in saying, you know. And I did pick up one of the planning private sector planners afterwards about this, and he said, well, you know, you kind of trade your worst stories and it's all part of the sort of banter really. And I think it sort of is, but I also think it's a little bit insidious. And I think we probably need a little bit more understanding between public and private sector planners. We found that the public were routinely abused by planners everywhere. They were very much othered in the academic language, but often with some degree of affection. You know, there was a sort of curious kind of public sector sort of, again, gallows humor, if you like, and the public were often the victims of that. We also found something, one of our planners talked about the planners being part of a goalkeepers union. There's a lot of things that tie planners together. You know, if you're in meetings where there are planners, architects, ecologists, you find over time that the organizational barriers tend to break down quite a lot. And the planners start sort of siding with each other and the ecologists side with each other. And an organizational kind of divisions start to melt away. That's very interesting. There's a very strong sense of what planners believe. And that is actually quite universal. It's quite interesting. And the other thing we sort of found was some quite interesting tensions between members and officers in local authorities, and often they were carefully negotiated and performed. And I think, you know, that is, it's a well-trodden area of planning research. It's well known amongst planners, but I think again it needs a bit of unpacking and a bit more understanding from both sides really about what it is that each other is trying to achieve. Okay, so these are my conclusions. We've got about 9 sort of findings that we might, you know, that we might pick up on 1 or 2 to maybe have a bit of a chat about. And these are still a bit tentative. We're still writing up a lot of these things, and we're not sure which ones are more important than the others. And we hope to get some feedback. So if anybody does have any, it would be great to hear that. I think the first thing to say is that there is a public service ethos that still exists in local authorities. It's alive and well. And it's generally speaking a very good thing, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. One of the early field notes that Abbey took was an enforcement officer, you know, with a very distressed member of the public who had obviously been let down by, you know, a number of people before from a variety of organisations, and he was reassuring her all the time, "I won't let you down. I promise I'll be there tomorrow. I'll come and see what it is that's troubling you." And one of our biographical interviews, a young planner actually, still in her 20s, working in London, said to us that she felt that her job was really explaining planning, the whole planning system. He said it's not their job to know the planning system, it's ours. And that's what we get paid to do. And it's our job to protect the residents, no matter how much they think we're doing it or how much they hate us. And it was really, really, it was wonderful to read that note and see this kind of, working with very hard to reach communities often in development management, right on the front line, where levels of English were often very poor, and trying really hard to communicate what was going on in their place, what development was happening. And how they could kind of act to try and change some of that. The second thing we found is the significance of place. And again, this seems a bit blatantly obvious if you're planners, but actually one of the things, again, that not just public sector planners, we looked at one private sector organisation which very much had a sort of sub-regional focus, and they had an encyclopedic knowledge of every developable piece of land, in that sub-region. But those bodies of knowledge are extremely important. What's happened in this place before, what might happen in the future, who owns the land, what sort of landowner are they? Are they a bit of a patron of the built environment, or are they just a sort of, rather sort of difficult, in it for the money, don't really care about the quality of what comes out? And that tacit knowledge that's around is really, really important. But it's not universal. It was interesting, one of our case studies was in a very much a sort of urban design consultancy. They tended to just cart the same sort of universal principles around wherever they went. And that's very, very valuable, what we in academia would call codified knowledge. But again, I think there is something about the way those different knowledges come together. And one of the important things that planners do is synthesize a lot of that. This is what's worked in other places. This is the great exemplars that we know from around the country and around the world, but this is also our local patch, and we know what's possible here, both in terms of organisations and in terms of kind of finance and so forth. We also noted the enduring nature of planning practices and cultures. Really interesting in our biographical interviews. We said, what about the 1991 Act, when, the plan became the big thing? Did this change your work, given you're the sort of strategic planning manager? Not a bit. There were all these things, the white paper that are so consumed about at the minute. Actually, when you look back 5 or 10 years later, nobody remembers Nicholas Ridley trying to tear up the planning system in 1989. It changed very little about what people do from day to day, and very little about planners' careers, and that was very, very interesting. There's also something in there as well about the way that planners carry this shared knowledge, but actually sometimes it might be a bit of a barrier. One of the planners talked about how a neighbourhood planning area had relaxed the planning restrictions on development in the open countryside, and that absolutely seemed to be the right thing for this place, where demand for building was low. There was a real problem of affordable housing in the countryside. But actually, every time a decision went to development management, it's like, oh, we can't possibly allow this thing. We don't do this sort of thing, even though it was part of the statutory planning framework to do something different. So I think there's a bit of reflectivity needed there as well about the things we hold to be true as planners, and whether sometimes we need to upset that. The fourth finding we had is the enduring nature of many of the debates in planning. Again, this historical thing we looked at. Should planners be specialists or generalists? We found some fascinating things in the archives from the 1950s about people complaining about private sector consultancies doing really shoddy work. And some people were saying that to us again. Similarly with private sector ethics, especially in economic downturns, where perhaps, there's a bit more of a scramble for work, and a bit more, a bit less of speaking truth to power, which is the vital thing that some private sector consultants do. Look, you really need to try harder here. We need to do a bit more. Fifthly, we found some interesting things around learning. I mean, particularly something for the RTPI to think about is austerity has hit public sector planners very hard in terms of the budgets they have, CPD and the like. The private sector, in our experience, having looked at 3 organisations, was that there's a lot of networking going on, uncosted business development meetings. They're hosting regional events for the RTPI all the time, lots of networking. But actually, the public sector is often denied those opportunities. They're not allowed time away. to attend debates, and you know, a lot of the things that they might have done 10 or 15, 20 years ago, they're not permitted to do anymore, either because there's a lot less staff or there's just simply no money to send them on courses. So the last two slides I have, two more of our findings. We felt that there were some interesting statements about a vision for planning. There was a lot of commitment to good planning in both the public sector and the private sector. It was often very hard to distinguish. You know, there is this idea that the public sector upholds the public interest and the private sector, you know, is more about opportunity seeking. Actually, that, you know, we didn't find that to be true a lot of the time, that the private sector was often acting as a check on some roguish public sector activity and all of those kind of things. So there's good planning everywhere. It's not a public versus private thing. There are good planners working in bad organizations. There are bad planners occasionally coming up, doing things around permitted development, which, you know, a lot of us would think they shouldn't be doing, particularly with a badge of RTPI behind their name. But we also had some negative things about the RTPI and so on. We had a field note where someone was saying that, you know, they felt the RTPI was very removed from the concerns of officers. So there's an awful lot of things which I'm sure people have heard before around, you know, what professional institute can do in the 21st century, and it's a very difficult challenge. One of the other things we found was a sort of decline in what we call acting space in the public sector. You know, there is a lot less room for manoeuvre for the average public sector planner, and often mitigation is all that can be achieved. It's a highly pragmatic positioning often. You know, it's not, you know, it's that old adage about, you know, it's not good enough to approve, it's just, you know, is it bad enough to say no to? And I think that's a real problem. You know, the pressure of the 5-year housing land supply cannot be understated. And I'm sure all the planners out here will know about that. You know, the absolute pressure to keep delivering housing just meant that, you know, really, really poor quality urban sprawl, slums of the future are being delivered constantly across all the regions we looked at. And we think that's a terrible thing. And it really, really needs to be one of the things we need to move on, particularly in contesting some of the things in the current white paper. And our final slide, really, two final things. We were very interested in what makes planning work professional work. You know, what right has a planner got to say, I'm a professional, in the way that a medic or a lawyer has? And planning has a long tradition of beating itself up over this. Many of us have been riding into battle on that and trying to say, you know, there are some things that make planning work very clearly skilled professional work. I think, again, we should do more as planners and perhaps through the Institute to define that and communicate that. But we saw a skill blending of this tacit and codified knowledge, knowing a place, knowing what might work in a place. But there's also some real skills problems. Design is a key one, which we all know about, I think. Strategic planning is another. You know, a lot of people having to buy people in for a year to progress their local plan at senior level. And that's a real problem. And I think it is starting to change. I think the loss of senior people in the last decade, or particularly perhaps more like 5 to 10 years ago, new people have come through, and I think that's starting to go away, but it's a definite problem. But the final thing I think I'd end on is quite a hopeful thing, is that actually in most of our case studies, we found some really good, strong leadership of planning organizations where there were really clear sense of what planning is there to do. It was values-led, it was moral. It was very moral. In public and private sector, actually, you know, the best private sector consultancies were the ones which had a strong ethical sense of what they were trying to achieve and had a positive workplace culture to support that. And that was a really encouraging thing. But there are dangers to that. I think particularly, as I've mentioned before, the public sector planners were especially vulnerable to a sort of muddling through as austerity kind of continually cut things they could do. And a lot of learning opportunities were outsourced to private sector consultants, and where there wasn't a lot of strategic leadership local to planning at the top of the organization. And I think that particularly came across in relation to sustainable development. You know, climate change not being taken seriously at local authority level and not being taken seriously by the local planning department as a result, because there was no support for it. And I think, you know, if you think about justice as a sort of motive for planning in a wider sense, you know, social justice, but also environmental justice, and we think about the grand challenges for the next decade or two of climate change, of air quality, of public health, you know, we can't avoid the fact that planners are now back in the realm of public health where they were 100 years ago, that you need that leadership at the top of an organization who recognizes those challenges and can think about, you know, a decade or two ahead, not just, you know, how do we get through this financial year. Okay, so that's my presentation. Someone no doubt will bring us back. But yes, sorry, a little over long, but never mind. We've got a lot to say.
Well, wow, what an amazing and thought-provoking piece of research. Listening to that, my mind was spinning back, and there was so much of what you said that I could relate to from my own experience, having started in local authority and spending 10 years there, then academia, then I've worked at regional level, then I've worked in local, in private sector and voluntary sector through RTPI Planning Aid, which I headed up for a couple of years. So there's so much there, and things that my mind was all over the place. I think that the bit that I recognise, though, from all that experience of all the different sectors that I've worked in, was actually your final point. That was the one that resonated with my experience, and about the values-led, and about the pride, and about the moral leadership. Those are the people that I've worked with and met, and the planners that I see when I go out to various places. And it's such a, you know, I'm so proud of where we are and how it is. But the one thing I did pick up particularly on, and I want to sort of come in on and ask you, it's going to be a bit of a side left question, so I'll give you a warning on that. But the context is, you are describing the way buildings and settings impact on the way we work. And there's real resonance on that, because when I was working for Birmingham City Council in the planning department there, we moved location 3 times. And this was me as a very junior planner. Prior to Nicholas Ridley, I will say, as a very junior planner, and I noticed how people's relationships within the office changed as a result simply of the different buildings and the different ways the internal structure of those buildings worked. One thing that jumped out to me, and here's where the question comes a bit side left, is that I felt the buildings, and you alluded to this, had an impact on the power structures, the layout of buildings within organisations. So the remote offices for the senior planner, you know, leaders, whatever, and then the smaller sort of cupboards for people like me at the more junior end of things. And it really began to strike me. But I also did pick up exactly you talked about the way the public responded when they came in to look at the files in the different buildings. So the side left question, you probably know one of my real passions is about diversity, equality and inclusivity within the profession. To what extent do you feel that the way the buildings that we are in impacts on that agenda? Is it a, you know, how does that work? How does it impact on how the diversity of how we engage with people when they come in? Because that power relationship changes that relationship we've got with the public massively. And how does, it's not just a gender thing, but it's also BAME, all of that. How do people feel comfortable and able then to rise within the profession? So it's a bit of a side left, but I wondered if, Abbey's nodding, when you did these interviews, did this come out?
Yeah,
This is Abbey's question, I think.
Chime in on that one. Certainly as a sociologist and non-planner going into planning environments and trying to observe these dynamics, there were many things that struck me, and one of them is in the local authority, this strong sense of class identity. That there was a sense that many of the planners came from the soil that they were serving. So that was interesting that they'd stayed local, but also just their class identity was being in some ways reinforced by the building that they were in, and the brownness of the tables and the homeliness of the teacups and the, you know, the second tier nature of the the swivel chairs and things like that. And I really wonder how that affects a person's sense of self, and whether that was becoming sort of mutually reinforced. That in some ways was good, because it created a strong sense of camaraderie, and it created a sense of affinity with public who were coming in, and there was sort of a cheap and cheerful aesthetic, I would say, to that environment, although also, as Geoff pointed out, a dehumanized one, as we were in this edge city setting that wasn't on a busy high street. At the same time, I think, thinking about BAME inclusivity, the whiteness of our study, particularly in local authority, was quite striking. And just hearing Geoff present today, I was developing some of my own thoughts about when you do have this sort of strong sense of white local authorities in the north, that possibly people from more diverse ethnic backgrounds feel much more comfortable in this cosmopolitan espresso drinking environment of the consultancy, where knowledge is less embedded in having grown up there, or you know, having particular signs that you recognize, even the sort of the type of banter, because you know it all connects. I would say that is creating imbalances, I think, in staffing and who's represented. I don't know if Geoff has anything to add to that.
Not really. I was just thinking it is so exclusively white. You know, we had a local authority in the south east of England, and that wasn't very much different, as I understand. I mean, the Sheffield team did that case study, but yes, I mean, we had to work quite hard to get some level of diversity into our project at all. So in our biographical interviews, we wanted some representation from different ethnic groups, and we actually had to sort of actively try and seek that to balance it out. So yeah, I think in short, I'm not sure. I suspect, yeah, there's nothing in our field work that would add much to what you probably already know. I mean, I suppose that the one thing I would say is that just the difficulties of seeing a planning officer anyway. And one of the realities of commercialization was, you find there is a community group trying to do something, and bits of the public sector want to charge them 500 quid to meet. And if you want to meet English Nature or Natural England, and if you want to meet 3 public sector organisations, they might all try and charge you 500 quid. So your beautiful project in your deprived community just can't get off the ground because you can't even afford to meet anyone. And I think that's a really sad, indictment of kind of where we're at.
I think those reflections there are really important, and things that we need to take away to look at in terms of the RTPI's diversity, equality, inclusivity strategy, because there must be things that we can put in place and support measures and actions to actually try and help this change, because it is a lot more than just numbers, isn't it? It's about feeling, it's about language. I think you talked about the language in the office, and I do recall somebody saying, I can't remember who it was, but the language sometimes we use in planning is very masculine and very white, whereas actually if we just change the name to something, it would be more inclusive of the whole community, and people would actually understand what we're talking about. The question I think that was thrown was, do people understand what development management is? It's a very powerful, we are up there managing, deciding sort of word. So really, really fascinating.
I think I would add to that hearing Tim talk about fuel poverty, there was something in his delivery that tells me that he's tasted some of life, that he's not from, I'm not saying you're from the grit of the, but there's something about planners or planning education, or like when I was hanging out with planners, some of them had very much professionalized not talking about where they've come from or what they've been through. And I think if there were to be more of that were more valued. It was when planners did that I really got excited, because it was a sense that you know, if planning has any kind of activist role in society and looking for social justice, to me that it has to, if the RTPI can connect to that, to where people have come from and what they've been through, and do that in a way that's diverse, that would be amazing.
I think just to finish on a sort of really positive piece, that you talked about how local authority planners sort of feel maybe the RTPI doesn't do enough and shout out enough. Then one of the really big successes has come. You know, you've heard of the Chief Planning Officer campaign, get the planners up at the top table. Well, actually, there are some good things in the white paper that we've got to welcome, and one of them is equivalent of the Chief Planning Officer and getting that up at the top table. And that was a big campaign from RTPI. And another one is really very much about the resources in the planning teams. So, you know, looking across the country, it's 40% cut in 10 years, but much more felt in the North and the West Midlands than it has been in the South and East. And I mean, I was saying that when we were launching the ambitions for the North, but again, the white paper actually recognises that. So it's not actually said the RTPI said, but it's there. That's the campaign. So we all know that unless we can get the local authority part, and this is public and private sector, everyone shares this view, get the local authority part to work right, then the system won't work right unless we get that right. So I think the support of the whole profession is behind, you know, whatever sector, that side of things. So it's hopefully that message, maybe it's about we're not communicating it enough. So that's a challenge out to all our RTPI regions. Let's just cascade what the RTPI is doing, and hopefully that then is mutually reinforcing and we start to think better of ourselves.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, that's great. That was a really useful discussion. Just to disambiguate completely, I am a planner and I'm very proud to be a planner, but I didn't come from that background. So just because, you know, imposter syndrome, you know, but, you know, I've worked in all sorts of things, you know, been a gardener, criminal justice, you know, all sorts of things. But you know, there is that to it. Planning's a diverse scene. I think it's drawing, increasingly I've seen it's drawn different people in from different backgrounds that found themselves to be planners. I think that's a brilliant thing because there's a lot in it. But equally, I wouldn't want to take away from the fact that there's actually a very knowledge-based and, you know, a training thing about this as well. So it's those two things coming together, is the values and the knowledge. Well, Sue, thanks for coming.
Thank you all so much. My mind is just buzzing now. It really is. And I'd love to read more about this study when you actually publish it. So make sure I'm on the email list for that.
Awesome. Will do. Thanks, Geoff, and thanks, Abbey. Absolutely brilliant. And let's see you next week, Sue. I think you're going to come back, aren't you, in a virtual sense?
I am. Right? Young planners, yes.
Absolutely. So for anybody watching, thanks for watching too. Thanks to Sue for coming. Thanks to Geoff and Abbey, and for Kim for putting all this on in the background. And we'll see you all soon. Brilliant. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.